Dear little one, an open letter to younger self. Chapter 6. The Revelation. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. When the new year dawns in many African countries, it brings with it a mixed sense of hope and weariness. A fragile hope that feels like a beam of light trying to pierce through the heavy layers of history and circumstance. The streets are often filled with the sounds of festive music and chatter, while children run around with makeshift toys, and vendors display their modest wares, hoping for a surge in holiday purchases. But beneath the festivity, there lingers a quiet reflection, an awareness of a deeper truth, that these holidays, with all their tinsel and trimmings, are imported relics of a colonial past. In many homes, preparations for Christmas and New Year begin with the gathering of family and community. Goats are slaughtered, meals are prepared in large pots over open fires, and local brews are shared under the sprawling shade of trees. Churches hold special services, where choirs sing hymns with a fervor that seems to transcend time. Yet even as these gatherings bring warmth and unity, there's an undeniable sense of borrowed identity, a feeling that these celebrations belong more to a foreign tradition than to the soil on which they are celebrated. Unlike countries such as Ethiopia, which maintains its ancient Ge'ez calendar and celebrates its own unique holidays, much of Africa follows the Gregorian calendar imposed during colonization. Time itself has been colonized, marked by dates and customs dictated by a distant world. This calendar dictates the rhythm of life, when to sow, when to reap, when to rest, when to celebrate, even when it feels out of sync with the land and its people. This realization brings with it a quiet cynicism, an awareness that the calendar is a symbol of control, of a history that refuses to fully let go. There is a lingering question. What would this time of year look like if it had not been shaped by colonial influence? What stories would we tell? What songs would we sing? What symbols would adorn our homes? Unlike countries like Ethiopia, with its ancient Ge'ez calendar, or China, with its steadfast adherence to the lunar cycle, much of Africa remains bound to a calendar imposed by former colonizers. It marks time not by the pulse of local traditions, but by the dictates of a far-off world. And while families gather for Christmas and New Year celebrations, exchanging gifts and attending church services, the festivities often feel like a borrowed costume, worn but never truly fitting. In the Western world, this season is a commercial frenzy, a spectacle of capitalism run rampant. Shops brim with goods, the air is thick with advertisements, urging consumers to buy more, spend more, indulge more. Shopping malls become pilgrimage sites, and the spirit of giving is often overshadowed by the pressure to give the right gifts, to keep up appearances. The streets are draped in glittering lights, and every advertisement screams of holiday cheer. But beneath the surface lies an orchestrated push to equate happiness with consumption. Meanwhile, in many African towns and villages, the season is quieter, simpler. There are no extravagant decorations, no frenzied gift-buying sprees. A drumbeat that calls people together and a shared pot of food prepared with care. A gathering under the stars where stories are told, and the sound of drums and laughter fills the night air. There is a warmth in these gatherings, a sense of community and connection that transcends material wealth. Children might fashion toys from scraps or craft ornaments from natural materials, drawing joy from what little they have. But even here, the colonial shadow looms. The imported plastic Christmas trees, the bright red Santa hats made from synthetic fabrics, and the jingles sung in foreign languages are stark reminders of a world shaped by someone else's traditions and timelines. Neo-colonial juxtaposition creates a unique tension. On the one hand, there is joy in gathering, in sharing meals, in connecting with loved ones. On the other hand, there is an undeniable sense of loss, a realization that much of what is celebrated is not truly ours, that the holidays themselves are part of a colonial legacy that continues to shape our lives. This is how I imagine Frantz Fanon reacting to this scene, shaking his head, his disappointment etched in every glance. mon frère. They've taken over the world. And I imagine Fanon standing before it all, deeply disappointed, saying, "We pretend not to see it." He doesn't chuckle at the decorated trees or the plastic Santas. There's no humor in his gaze. Instead, there's a weary resignation, a frustration born of watching history repeat itself. "They've changed the chains, my friend, but they never took them off," he says, his voice cutting through the layers of borrowed traditions. Independence may have been declared on paper, but Fanon sees the colonial mind still steering our calendars, our holidays, our very sense of time. His gaze pierces through the facade, exposing the uncomfortable truth. We drape colonial relics in local colors and call it culture. What would a decolonized celebration look like? In Rwanda, it would begin with the murera tree, adorned not with tinsel, but with handmade ornaments crafted from banana fibers, clay, and cowrie shells. Instead of plastic Santas, children would carve small figurines of Imana, the spirit of creation, honoring the ancestors and the sacred connection between the people and the land. The cycle of celebrations would align with the agricultural calendar. The Umuganura, the harvest festival, would be the centerpiece, a time to give thanks for the bounty of the land and to share food with the entire community. Songs would be sung in Kinyarwanda, the voices weaving together stories of resilience and survival, passed down through generations. The dances would be powerful, grounded in the movement of cattle herders and farmers, celebrating life's rhythms and the resilience of the people. The decorations would come from the earth's bounty, woven mats, gourds, and clay pots painted with traditional patterns, symbols of life, fertility, and connection to the ancestors. It would be a celebration not of consumerism, but of kinship, of community, and of the sacred balance between humanity and nature. Gifts would be modest and meaningful, perhaps a basket of freshly harvested beans, a handmade piece of clothing, or a carved wooden spoon. The emphasis would be on togetherness, on storytelling around the fire, on honoring the past while looking toward the future with hope. With a sigh that carries generations of struggle, Fanon's imagined voice lingers, "We never learn." But perhaps, in these moments of reconnection, we can begin to remember what was always ours. There is a dissonance in this borrowed festivity, a rupture in the rhythm of life. The nativity scenes, with their pale-skinned figures, sit like relics from a distant dream, incongruous against the backdrop of African skies and red clay roads. The songs tell tales of shepherds in faraway lands, but where are the stories of our own hills, our rivers, our ancestors? The wisdom of elders, once passed down through whispered proverbs and shared rituals, has been drowned out by imported hymns. This dissonance is more than aesthetic. It is a fracture in time itself. We celebrate on dates dictated by a distant empire's calendar, a cycle that bends our seasons, our harvests, to foreign rhythms. The Gregorian calendar hangs heavy over our lives, a silent clock ticking in tune with histories that are not ours. It asks us to look to Bethlehem, but what of Kibeho? What of our sacred places, our own miracles? This festivity does not flow from the land's pulse. It is an imposed song, out of tune with the soil beneath our feet. The dissonance is a ghostly echo of a colonial past, lingering in the air as we gather around plastic trees and sing words in borrowed tongues. This time of year carries with it both joy and a quiet melancholy. The joy of community, of shared meals and togetherness, and the melancholy of knowing that even the calendar itself is a relic of a colonial past. It forces a reflection. What might these celebrations look like if they were truly ours? If the stories we told, the songs we sang, and the symbols we adorned our homes with reflected our own histories, our own cultures, our own truths. So when I made that call on January 2nd, it wasn't just about seasonal greetings. It was about piercing through layers of history and imposed silence, a call sent across fractured time. The dates on the calendar, these markers of a colonial past, felt irrelevant in that moment. The conversation began casually, as if we were simply flowing along in the rhythm of someone else's drum. But beneath the surface, something raw and ancient stirred, a need to reclaim forgotten connections, to speak truths long buried. It was a rebellion disguised as a conversation, a voice reaching through the void to say, "We are still here. We remember." I called Pasis, my cousin who returned to the motherland in the aftermath of 1994's chaos, a time when the land itself seemed to mourn its children. His journey home was a quiet pilgrimage, a walk back through corridors of memory that many had chosen to seal off. There, among the hills and valleys that had once held laughter and loss, he traced invisible footprints, paths that seemed to emerge only in the light of returning eyes. His voice on the line carried more than words. It was an echo of resilience, a tone weathered by the dust of ancestral stories and silences too heavy to lift. We exchanged season's greetings as if it were an ordinary ritual, but beneath the casual pleasantries, a tempest of unspoken truths churned. The air between us was dense with the weight of history, fractured timelines and severed ties, and each word, though warm, was an attempt to mend a tapestry unraveled by distance and erasure. "I'm traveling to Mugombwa," Pachis said, a smile in his voice. "We do this every year, you know? We head back to the village, see everyone, catch up, exchange gifts, mostly simple stuff, but it means a lot. And of course, we share a big meal together. It's just what we do. It keeps us grounded, reminds us where we come from." Mugombwa. The name struck something deep in me, my grandfather's land, or what was left of it. It had been carved away, stolen in pieces, by the lions, figures cloaked in power and greed, their shadows lengthening with each generation. They did not simply take land, they consumed dreams, devoured legacies, and left behind only fragments of memory, like brittle leaves swept into forgotten corners of the mind. But now, those fragments stir, pieces of a puzzle once hidden in veils of dusk, now catching light. The memories, once distant echoes, begin to gather form, emerging through the mist like figures stepping out of a long-forgotten painting. Faces half-remembered, stories spoken in hushed tones, lands once vibrant with life, all pressing against the edges of consciousness, demanding to be seen, to be reclaimed. The fragments refuse to remain buried. They rise, persistent, like roots breaking through hardened soil. These lions were never satisfied. Their hunger was endless, gnawing at the edges of dignity, their greed stretching beyond the visible horizon. My mother's voice would harden when she spoke of them, as if each word bore the weight of generations lost to their claws. "They don't just take," she would say. "They come back to take more." Perhaps it was this weight that made her vow never to return to that land. Even though she lived just a stone's throw from Rwanda in neighboring Burundi, she stayed away. Burundi, where she had built a life with a ruthless Burundian husband, became a land of exile, a refuge wrapped in iron bars. Her laughter, once bright and defiant, was now a whisper that barely crossed the threshold of her own silence. She had traded one set of chains for another, each link forged by the same greed that drove the lions. Their shadows stretched across borders, crawling into her dreams, dragging memories she had tried to bury deep. The air in her home was thick with unspoken grief, a sorrow that clung to her skin like the scent of smoke after a fire. The lions were never far. Their claws were not just on the land but in her mind, scraping away hope, leaving behind only ash and echo. And who expects them to be anything else? These beasts are driven by hunger, a hunger that sees no end. Their bellies full, they still search for more, consuming not because they need to, but because they can. They prowl through borders, through laws, through memories, always taking, never satisfied. The world bends to them because it always has, and perhaps because we let it. Their roar drowns out the whispers of those who remember, of those who resist. And yet somewhere in the quiet spaces, there is defiance. There is the soil that refuses to forget. I learned this from your mother, who spoke of the lion with a mixture of fear and defiance. Her words were like seeds planted in your mind, stories that took root and grew into a quiet resolve. "Never forget," you would whisper to your soul, a command as ancient as the land itself. Your eyes, like windows to a storm, gazed toward a past that refused to be buried, a defiant memory stirring beneath layers of dust and time. It was a past that resisted silence, roots coiling deep into the soil, refusing to be severed by greed or forgotten by time. The stories, the voices, the scars, they lingered like embers in the ash, waiting to ignite again. "We come from this soil," you reminded yourself, as if the earth itself spoke through you. No matter how much they take, they cannot take that. The land remembers, and so do we. It remembers through the cracks in the earth, where forgotten roots stretch out, seeking the light. It remembers through the winds that whisper names long buried, carrying the scent of rain and soil from one generation to the next. The stones remember, worn smooth by the passing of countless feet, echoing footsteps that walked here long before maps drew borders. The trees remember, standing tall, their branches outstretched like arms longing to embrace stories that refuse to die. The sea remembers too, in its restless tides, carrying remnants of forgotten songs, of boats that never returned, of names lost to the deep. The waves crash against the shores, relentless, as if trying to carve those stories into the rocks themselves. It is in the silence between songs, in the pauses between breaths, where the land and sea hold their defiance. A memory that resists erasure, that refuses to bow to the weight of forgetting. The sea holds secrets, buried beneath its surface, waiting for the moment when they rise with the tide to meet the sky. Medaridi and Francis, your grandfather's brothers, had clung to the remnants, trying to survive on what remained after the lion's theft. They were custodians of a legacy reduced to whispers, yet those whispers refused to die. They moved like shadows through the corridors of memory, echoing in forgotten places, stubborn and persistent. Power sought to erase them, to draw borders over their stories, to bury their names beneath layers of rewritten history. But the land rebelled. The soil bore witness, like an elder whose silence holds centuries of wisdom. The rains carried the scent of ancestors, their voices rising with the winds that swept through valleys and over hills. It was not just the land that remembered. The rivers sang the names of those lost, and the flames in sacred fires danced with the stories of the past. Memory was not a passive thing. It was alive, infused in the drumbeats, in the chants, in the way the earth itself hummed with defiance. Erasure could not reach where spirit dwelled. The spirits of those who had walked before stood guard over the stories, unyielding, refusing to be silenced. In the folds of dusk, they whispered back, "We are still here." The soil, like a conspirator, preserved what it was told to forget. The winds carried the scent of ancestral fires, rekindling embers hidden in the cracks of time. These whispers were not just remnants. They were weapons of defiance, stories sharpened into blades to cut through the fabric of erasure. To remember was to resist. These were the stories that time and greed could not erase, roots that twisted beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break through the hardened soil. The legacy lived in the fragments of songs, in the rhythm of footsteps retracing ancestral paths, and in the quiet defiance of those who refused to let the past be swallowed by silence. It was a pulse beneath the land, a heartbeat that no lion could silence. There was something restless inside you, an ache you couldn't name, but it lived in the forgotten corners of your childhood. It was the faint imprint of a figure you only knew through whispers, the outline of a face traced in memory but never fully seen, like the remnants of a dream that lingers upon waking. It lingered in the lull between bedtime stories, in the murmurs of conversations carried on the breeze outside your window, in the way your mother would fall silent at the mention of certain names, her hands pausing mid-motion, as if she feared that even the sound of her own breath might summon ghosts from the past. her eyes would shift, looking toward the horizon beyond the window, searching, perhaps, for something she had long buried in her heart, but never truly let go. There was no mistaking it. In those moments, her silence was louder than any spoken word, each pause weighted with grief and longing. You felt it in moments when a stranger's voice carried a rhythm you couldn't place, stirring something dormant in your chest, a pull toward places you hadn't been but knew deeply. Certain names, spoken in passing, would land differently in your ears, weighted with meaning they didn't reveal outright. Each instance was a thread, connecting you to stories you hadn't heard, but somehow always knew existed, waiting beneath the surface. It wasn't just an ache, it was a call, a pull towards something unnamed yet deeply yours. It was the scent of rain-soaked earth that reminded you of a place you'd never been, the warmth of a fire that brought comfort, but no clear source. It tugged at the edges of your thoughts like a melody that refused to fade, distant, yet persistent. It gnawed at your composure, turning silence into a weight you couldn't carry for long. The ache became sharper with each passing moment, a whisper that grew louder the more you tried to suppress it, a voice insisting on being remembered, no matter how deeply buried. It wasn't the kind of longing that faded into the background. It pulsed with life, like an ember waiting to catch flame. You couldn't ignore it any longer. It demanded to be heard, to be known, to shatter the quiet into fragments of truth. It moved through you like a river finding its path, reshaping the landscape of your mind until the words left your mouth before you could second-guess them. "When you go to Mugombwa, could you pass the phone to Medaridi? I really want to speak to him." The request hung between you and Pasis like smoke in the air, curling into shapes neither of you could quite grasp. He chuckled softly, the sound warm, but laced with curiosity. "Medaridi?" His voice held the lilt of someone pulling at an unexpected thread. "You sure? He might talk your ear off." "I don't mind," you said quickly, though the weight of your words sat heavy in your chest. They weren't just words. They were a key, turning in a lock you had long pretended wasn't there. Pasis went quiet for a moment, considering. Then, something in his tone shifted. Less teasing, more thoughtful. "You know, it's been a while since anyone called to speak to them directly. People don't usually remember, but you remembered, not just in feelings, but in the way your grandfather's voice softened when he spoke of those long gone. You had asked him once about his brothers, sisters, and parents, your questions hesitant but insistent, as if even at that age you understood that what he carried might slip away. His words unfurled carefully, each name drawn out with reverence, as though conjuring spirits from the past. You watched his face change as he spoke, a quiet sorrow in his eyes, mixed with a tenderness you rarely saw. He spoke of his brother's laughter, how it filled the air on long walks home, how it echoed through the fields like a song meant to be remembered. His sisters, he said, had a way of teasing and comforting in the same breath, their voices laced with warmth that made the harshest days bearable. He described the way their parents gathered them close in hard seasons, holding them steady when the world seemed uncertain. Each story emerged slowly, as though peeling back layers of time, revealing faces and moments long buried. These weren't just stories. They were lifelines, fragments of a life shaped by connection and loss, each detail pulling those distant figures closer until you could almost see them standing in the doorway, waiting to be known. His voice would linger in your mind long after he had finished speaking, the cadence of his words threading through your thoughts like an old song. You didn't fully grasp it then, the weight of what he had entrusted to you. But as time passed, those names and stories became part of you, resurfacing at unexpected moments, in the rustle of leaves, in the scent of old books, in the way you carried silence like it held meaning. His stories filled the spaces left by silence, giving shape to the unnamed figures that haunted your thoughts. Their names weren't just words, they became whispers on the wind, Impressions in your memory that you couldn't explain, like echoes of a place you had never been but somehow knew. And though time dulled the edges of memory, you carried them still, unknowingly preserving fragments of a history you weren't supposed to forget, where innocence held the weight of truths waiting to surface. "I think they know me too," you murmured, almost to yourself. "From when I was a child." There was a pause, a breath held between two lives, two truths. The hours melted into the day, quiet and reflective, as if time itself waited for something to break the silence, as if a single word could rupture the stillness and send ripples through everything you thought you knew. You wandered through familiar routines, but your mind kept returning to Mugombwa, a place shaped by imagination, its essence pieced together from photographs and distant stories. The red soil roads you had never walked, winding past hills you had only seen on satellite images, became vivid in your mind. You pictured the scent of eucalyptus trees mingling with the morning mist, the shadows of the hills stretching long across fields you had never stood in. You imagined Paces stepping into a pre-1994 market square, a place where your grandfather once ran a bakery shop and a family restaurant, or so the stories said. At least from what Grandpa had told you, and from tales posthumously shared by friends who had known him, it was more than just a business. It was a cornerstone of the community, a place where people gathered not just to eat, but to share their lives. The scent of freshly baked bread, the clang of pots from the kitchen, the murmur of voices trading news and laughter, all of it became part of your imagining. It wasn't just a market, it was a meeting place, a crossroads of stories and livelihoods. It was a place woven into the fabric of Mugombwa, and through these stories it became woven into you too, a connection to a past you had never walked, but somehow always carried. You had never visited, but you could almost hear it, feel it, as though you had been there in another life. The vendors sat with their woven baskets, the hum of quiet transactions blending with stories carried on the breeze. You conjured the toll of the church bell in the distance, a sound that, in your mind, echoed through Butare district like a call to remember. Stories had it that your grandfather's house and ancestral land sat only a few yards from Mugombwa Parish and the soccer playground. In your imagination, you could see children kicking a ball across the dusty field, their laughter mingling with the bell's distant chime, the rhythms of life and memory interwoven, forming a landscape both familiar and elusive. In those still moments, you saw him walking past homes you had only glimpsed through pixels. Wooden shutters faded by years of sun and rain, imagined laughter drifting from fields where children ran barefoot through rows of banana trees. But as you watched, the scene blurred, shifting into something older, more sacred. The rustle of leaves stirred a sense of presence, as though the landscape itself remembered. It wasn't whispers you heard, but something deeper. The feeling of being watched over by those who had come before. In the sway of banana trees, you felt your grandfather's quiet strength, his steady hands shaping loaves of bread, his voice guiding the rhythm of a day long past. The soft wind carried more than stories. It carried a history etched into the soil, the red earth holding traces of footsteps that had never been erased. Your grandfather appeared first, his gaze steady, filled with unspoken words. Behind him, others followed, figures who had lived and loved on that land long before your time, their footsteps leaving imprints in the red earth. They watched you with quiet recognition, as if to say, "We have always been here, we never left." Their voices rose in unison, each one distinct yet bound together by shared memory. "We walked these paths, tilled this land, built these homes, and we are still here, in the wind that sweeps across the fields, in the soil beneath your feet." Your grandfather stepped forward, his gaze shimmering like a mirage, unfixed, fluid, as though memory itself was trying to hold him in place. His words drifted on the air, indistinct at first, but then clear and resonant. "I left this land, but it never left me. Even in exile, I could feel the soil beneath my feet, smell the bread baking, hear the laughter carried on the wind. His form shimmered and shifted, blurring at the edges like smoke caught in a rising wind. The trees bent toward him, the hills seemed to bow, and the red earth trembled underfoot. His voice, resonant yet elusive, came from everywhere at once. The air, the soil, the stones beneath your feet. Exile is not an ending, he intoned, his words laced with the cadence of rain on parched land. It is a passage. Death is not a parting. We remain, in the rhythm of the drums, in the chant of the elders, in the firelight that dances across faces. He lifted his hands, and the landscape around him breathed. We are in the roots that hold the earth together. We rise with the morning mist and settle with the evening dust. We are the river that carves through stone, the wind that whispers the forgotten names. His gaze pierced through time, reaching beyond the veil of life and death. You think you come to find us, but we have always been here, woven into this place, this land, this blood. You are us, we are you. The landscape around him seemed to breathe, each element carrying a piece of him. The cracked shutters, the swaying trees, the worn path to the churchyard. You came searching for us, but we were never truly gone. We are in the stories you tell, in the steps you take toward home. His eyes met yours, luminous and timeless. And now, we walk with you. Another voice followed, softer, maternal. You carry us with you. Our stories live through you. Our laughter, our struggles, our hopes, they are yours to hold now. Her voice lingered like a breeze stirring the leaves. With every step you take, you tread the paths we once walked. The rain that falls on your face once fell on ours. Even in exile, we knew its touch, a distant echo of home, carrying with it the scent of Mugombwa. It soaked into our skin, seeped into our dreams, and in its rhythm, we heard the land calling us back. The rivers that nourish the land carry our reflections still, winding through time and space, bearing the stories we left behind. They are threads of memory flowing endlessly, unbroken by distance or death. We remain within them, just as they remain within you. We are the soil that holds you, the sky that shelters you. Remember, child, time may stretch and bend, but it does not wash us away. We are woven into the breath of this world. Another voice followed, softer yet filled with an unyielding strength. Our names live in the stones and roots, etched into the landscape. When you call on us, we rise. We speak through the rustle of trees, through the quiet hum of the earth beneath your feet. Let your heart be steady, like the roots of the Iroko tree. In storms and in calm, stand tall. You are never alone. A chorus of voices joined, distant and near, rising like the rhythm of a drumbeat carried by the wind. Our stories are your stories. Our struggles are your foundation. Do not let the world forget us. We walk beside you, unseen but never absent. Carry our light. Keep it burning. We are the fire in your bones, the rhythm in your step, the wisdom in your spirit. You are our legacy. You are the dream we planted long ago. Then a chorus rose, soft, ancient, and unbroken. Walk with courage. Walk with grace. Carry our names with reverence. We are the fire in your bones, the rhythm in your blood, the wisdom in your heart. You are our legacy. You are our blessing. The figures around you nodded, their expressions solemn. Remember this, the land remembers. The trees, the hills, the rivers, they have seen it all. We are part of it, and so are you. Do not let our names fade. Do not let our stories die. You felt their words settle within you, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, a sacred charge woven into the very fibers of your being. In that moment, you understood. You were the bridge between what was and what would be. Their voices were the rivers that had always flowed beneath your skin, the wind that had whispered through your dreams. You carried their blessings now, their laughter and grief, their triumphs and wounds. Listen carefully, one voice said. Wisdom is not the loudest sound. It moves in quiet places, waiting for those who choose to hear. "Do not fear forgetting," one voice said, steady and resonant. "Memory is the soil from which life grows. We are not lost in the past. We rise with the dawn, carried by those who remember." "Be like the river," an older voice followed, sharper now. "Flow forward, carve new paths through stone, but never forget your beginning. Even rivers return to the sky before falling back to the earth." The keeper of their legacy, the bearer of their light. And with each step you would take from this moment on, they would walk beside you, their hands resting lightly on your shoulders, their songs echoing through the chambers of your heart, guiding you toward what must come next. Thoughts circled like unspoken prayers, their weight undeniable. This was more than memory. It was a reckoning with those who had built the world you now stood in, those who had whispered through the silence, waiting for you to listen. The names Pacis carried with him weren't just names. They were keys to locked doors in your memory, pieces of a puzzle you had long tried to fit together, without knowing what the picture would reveal. They carried the weight of generations, names that held entire worlds within them, stories of a home you never knew, resilience, love, and loss. Each name carried a weight beyond words, etched into the air like echoes of footsteps in forgotten halls. They were fragments of stories fractured by time, waiting to be pieced together by those who dared to listen. You realized they were not just whispered. They were calling, insistent, demanding to be known again. Every name was a threshold, a crack in time that split open the earth beneath your feet, revealing fragments of lives once lived. These were not just names. They were entire worlds folded into syllables, stories etched in stone and soil, waiting for you to kneel, to touch the land and listen. Mugombwa's hills breathed with these truths, waiting not just for your return, but for your recognition. To know them was to know yourself, and in knowing yourself, you began to see the fractures in the stories you were told. Their names were not just echoes from the past. They were foundations, lifelines, threads etched into the foundation of your being, like roots twisting through ancient soil, binding you to a history that refuses to be forgotten. Each truth reclaimed was a step toward wholeness. Each name spoken was a piece of yourself returned. To know them was to carry their light forward, to stand in their footsteps, and to build something lasting from the soil of memory. They weren't just pieces to fit together. They were truths waiting to be claimed. In Mugombwa, a place you knew only through imagination, history seemed to breathe through every corner, through whispers from a distant time. The elders, with their stories, appeared in your mind's eye, their words flowing like rivers, steady and enduring, shaping the contours of a land that existed both in memory and in the unspoken spaces of your heart. Their voices wrapped around you like the scent of rain on dry earth, soothing yet awakening something restless within. A longing to know the stories left untold, to piece together a history that had been waiting quietly for someone to listen. It wasn't until night gave way to dawn, after the journey had been made, that the moment finally arrived. Pacis must have sat in the old family home, where the light fell in soft streaks through cracked shutters, casting patterns that seemed to shift with each passing moment, like time itself weaving between the past and present. And with every shift of the light, you couldn't shake the ache of knowing that his footsteps touched ancestral ground before yours. It wasn't resentment, but something deeper, a longing twisted with envy and a wound that only exile could carve. Pacis was there, breathing the air you had only imagined, feeling the soil that should have dusted your own feet first. His feet stirred the dust where your grandfather once walked, where voices you'd never heard still whispered in the trees. You pictured him tracing familiar paths that felt like they were yours by right, yet were denied by distance and silence. This was how exile hurt. It kept you distant from the land that held your name, your history, your blood. And yet, beneath the ache, there was something else. A quiet hope that his presence, his steps, might somehow carry you there too, bridging the distance between longing and belonging. Exile had hollowed out a space in your heart that only the land could fill. You felt it now, like a wound that had never truly healed. A yearning not just for a place, but for the touch of soil, the scent of familiar air, the grounding of being where your ancestors once stood. His footsteps on that land stirred the ache deeper, because it should have been you as well. It was a longing for more than memory. It was a longing to reclaim what had always been yours. The day unfolded quietly, the weight of unspoken words pressing against your chest. You moved through the morning in fragments, the way sunlight caught on the floorboards, the distant hum of life beyond the window. Each hour passed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the world itself waited. But waiting turned to aching as your mind drifted to Paxis in Mugombwa, stepping into spaces where your blood still lived in the soil. You pictured him there, feet pressing into red earth that held your ancestors' footprints, breathing air that carried the scent of their stories. And it stung, because you weren't there to feel it for yourself. When he handed you the phone, his solemn nod was both an offering and a reminder of everything exile had taken from you. He had stood where you hadn't. He had touched what you longed to touch. And now, the voices on the other end of the line would be your only way to cross that distance, to make up for what the land itself had denied you. In the background, you heard the shuffle of feet, the muffled exchange of voices. Passis's voice, low and steady, faded into the distance as the phone passed from hand to hand. Then, another voice came through the line. "Hello." The voice came from an old man, weathered and slow, like the creak of a door opening after years of silence. It struck you like a drumbeat, resonant and grounding. The voice was old, cracked with time, carrying the weight of journeys and loss, like the rustle of dry leaves in a forgotten grove. It pulled you backward through time, threading together years of silence with a single word. You felt your breath catch, your chest tighten, as if the air itself recognized the gravity of that voice. A sound from a place where memory and spirit intertwined. The years stretched between you dissolved in an instant, as though time bowed to the power of recognition. That single word was not just a greeting. It was a summons from the past, pulling both presence and absence into one moment. "Hello," you managed, your voice catching slightly. There was a pause, but it wasn't empty. It was a silence that held the weight of generations, like the air thick with the scent of rain before a storm. It carried the quiet rustle of ancestors stirring in recognition, a moment when memory took shape and stood alongside you, filling the space between words with everything that had been lost and everything that remained. "Is this the sun?" the old man asked, his voice carrying both the weight of recognition and the need for confirmation, as if he was certain but still seeking assurance. "Yes," Pakas confirmed softly. A pause lingered, heavy with time, before the old man spoke again, his voice softening with emotion. "You look so big and grown." There was a wistfulness in his tone, as though seeing a ghost of the past made real. His voice steadied. "We are standing on the land of your ancestors. This, here where I stand, is where you were born." "Yes," you whispered. "It's me." The quiet stretched again, but this time it wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge, one built from shared history and unspoken truths, finally coming to light. "Hello," another one said, softer this time, his face emerging at the corner of the phone's camera, blurred at first, like a memory coming into focus. And just like that, the silence had no power. It could no longer hold you apart. The image steadied, a weathered face, his eyes searching the screen as though reaching across time to see you fully. "It's good to hear you," he said, steady and certain, though his face broke into a grin that cracked through the solemn air. I am Medaridi, he added, tilting his head proudly as though expecting applause. And this here is Francois, he said, jabbing a thumb toward the screen. Francois raised his hand in a half-hearted wave, his expression deadpan. You see, Medaridi continued with exaggerated flair, we've been waiting a long time for this moment. Years, decades. I was starting to think you'd forgotten us. And Francois here, well, he was ready to write a letter, if you can believe that. Francois rolled his eyes. I don't even know where to get a stamp. Medaridi snorted. But here we are, and look at you, so big, so grown. He leaned closer to the camera, squinting dramatically. Have you been eating well? I hope you haven't gone skinny on us. Francois leaned in. He looks all right. Maybe too much bread, Francois added with a smirk, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer to the camera. Or maybe not enough. Hard to tell with you. Medaridi chuckled, shaking his head. Leave the boy alone. He's come back to us, hasn't he? That's what matters. He squinted at the screen, his expression softening with warmth. Besides, he looks just like his father, only that the father is gaunt, with a thoughtful gaze that lingered a moment longer than most. His thin face carried kindness in its quiet lines, and there was something measured in the way he spoke. Soft, deliberate, as if every word held the weight of something unsaid. With a thin face and soft eyes, the kind that seemed to take in everything quietly, and the way he smiled, gentle, a little crooked, as if each word was chosen carefully before it left his lips. He spoke softly too, Medaridi added with a nod, like he was always listening more than talking. Medaridi gasped, slapping Francois lightly on the shoulder. Too much bread? You'd be so lucky to have too much bread, Francois. The mention of your father startled you, as if the ground beneath you had shifted. My father? You asked, the words catching in your throat. Who? Which father are you talking about? You couldn't steady yourself. The question escaped you, fast and sharp, not out of anger but out of disbelief. Like someone tossing you a gift they'd kept hidden for years, only to see if you'd drop it in shock. Your heart clenched, but it wasn't just the years of silence or the stories you'd been denied pressing against you. It was the absurdity of it all. After everything, the long stares, the quiet questions, the refusal to even say his name, here it was, handed to you casually, like an afterthought, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. And it burned, the casualness of it, the ease. You could almost laugh at the sheer cruelty of how simple it seemed to them, how unremarkable the revelation was in their mouths, when for you, it had been a question clawing at the inside of your skull for years. But of course, they didn't know that. Or maybe they did, and maybe that was the worst part of all. So, you said, your tone cutting through the silence like a blade. He has a name. Now, just like that. Your voice wavered between disbelief and something sharper. Anger, curiosity, longing all tangled together. For years, nothing. Not a word. And now you're just dropping it like a piece of lost luggage? Saying you met my father like it's the most normal thing in the world? What's his name? Medaridi blinked, caught off guard by the force in your voice. His expression remained steady, but his mouth tightened slightly, as though weighing what to say next. He came here looking for you, he said, slow and deliberate. His name is Ndayishimiye, but I forgot the first name. You stared at him, incredulous. Medaridi rubbed the back of his neck, glancing away for a moment before speaking. As a matter of fact, he said with a hesitant grin, he left me some money. 5,000 francs. He paused, then added with a sheepish chuckle. We weren't sure what to do with it, so we bought some bread and a chicken for Christmas supper. He shrugged, a little defensive. It was a good chicken, you know. Francois said it was the best we'd had in years. Francois chimed in from the background, deadpan as ever. It really was. very tender. Medaridi rolled his eyes. Anyway, he continued, he left a phone number. He said you should have it. The words hung between you like smoke, curling into shapes you couldn't quite grasp. A phone number, a link, something so simple yet so monumental. And still, the absurdity of it all burned through your chest. Paces cleared his throat, shifting the phone in his hand. Tomorrow, he said, his tone steady. I'll reach out to him tomorrow. The man, your father. I'll call him and see if he'll talk. He tapped the number into his phone, then glanced at you. And I'll share the number with you. You'll need it. You nodded, the weight of everything settling over you like a blanket. Too heavy to shrug off, too warm to cast away. Thank you, you whispered. The conversation wound down slowly, gently, like waves pulling back from the shore, leaving the sand reshaped but steady beneath your feet. Medaridi and Francois handed the phone back to Pacis with quiet nods and smiles, their faces lingering on the screen a moment longer, before vanishing into the past from which they had emerged. We'll talk again, you promised, your voice softer now, steadier. Soon. Pacis nodded. Tomorrow, he said, tapping his phone. I'll call him, the man who might be your father, and I'll make sure you have his number. There was a pause, a shared understanding hanging in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. When the call ended and the screen went dark, you sat in the quiet, the echoes of their voices still lingering around you. Something had shifted, something irreparable, yet necessary. And there it was, the truth, surfacing at last. Not given freely, but pulled from the depths, breaking through the hardened soil of years spent in silence. It was a truth that had always been there, waiting for someone to reach out and claim it. They spoke his name, your father's name, without hesitation, without shame. It was a name you hadn't heard in years, a name that had been hidden from you by those who thought silence could erase it. But names have a way of surviving. They linger in the spaces between words, in the quiet moments when memory refuses to fade. The weight of this new revelation settled over you like a blanket, warm and suffocating all at once. To be remembered by those you had never truly known. What did that mean? It wasn't just recognition. It was a claim, a reminder that even in your absence, you had never been forgotten. Their voices, steady and familiar, carried memories that weren't yours to hold, but had always belonged to you. And that thought stirred something deeper. A quiet ache and a fierce longing, mingling with the absurdity of it all. What did it mean to be seen, to be named by people who had been reduced to distant echoes? It felt like standing at the edge of a story you'd been told wasn't yours, only to find out it always had been. Because here is the truth you must carry now. Truth is stubborn. It finds cracks to slip through, light to catch, just as it had with you. It lingered in your silences, in the spaces between the stories you were told and the ones you knew were missing. And now, as the voices reached across the years, you saw how truth never really leaves. It waits, quietly taking root, ready to break through hardened soil when the moment comes. It will not stay buried forever. They took much from you by keeping him away, his stories, his presence, his name. But they did not take everything. Some roots run too deep to be severed, some names too sacred to be erased. You carry them now, not as burdens, but as torches. Keep them lit, always. But there was something else, too. An unease, a restless tug at the edges of your thoughts. What they had given you wasn't just a truth reclaimed. It was a doorway open to questions that might never have answers. Who had he been beyond the stories they chose to tell? What parts of him were hidden even now, folded into the silence they hadn't yet broken? And what would it mean one day to hold those pieces together in your hands? The ache inside you wasn't simply for the past, it was for what might come next. To know his name was to begin unraveling something vast, something that stretched beyond you and back through time. The torch you carried wasn't just light. It was a spark, waiting to ignite the future you hadn't yet imagined. Because here is another truth you must carry. Knowing is never the end. It is only ever the beginning.